Okay. First of all, can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Anyone? You have to unmute. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, they can hear you.
Okay. So, hope you had a great weekend. Before we go further, so I want to tell you what we're going to be doing today. First of all, if you go on to Blackboard, under course materials, you'll find the PowerPoint for today's class, for today's lecture. And we'll be following that PowerPoint as we go through. Then, round about 11:45, we're going to be seeing the first of those documentaries. Miracle, really. I was really concerned how I would ever get you to be able to view these documentaries because they're in 3 DVDs. The first one, which we need now, was locked up in my office. The second one is in Mr. Castellano's office in the IT center. I was able to get the third one, but the third one, I don't think I'll be seeing much of. Fortunately, I was able to get the first one, but then the question was, how am I going to ever post it so that you could see it, right? Thanks to my wife's technological skills and my younger daughter's organizational abilities, we were able to figure out a way to post them. They're not all there yet. We'll add more as we go on, but the first 3 or 4 are under the DVD movies tab on Blackboard. So we'll follow that order as we discuss the different topics today. And then at about, as I said, 11:45, we'll be looking at the first of the documentaries that goes along with the class. Actually, probably one class behind, but no problem. You'll be able to see it when I show it on my screen. It'll show up on your screen, and you have the opportunity to see it again, plus others if you like, because they're now to be found under the DVD movies tab on Blackboard. So I want to begin with, some of this might be a bit of a review, but we're going to move from the beginning, that is, say, the assassination in June, on June 28th of 1914. We're going to move forward. For the next class, we'll probably have to finish it. I think we're not going to get through all of it, but we're leading up toward the famous von Schlieffen Plan, which was the war plan that the Germans had in place for the inevitable conflict with the French and the Russians. And this is all going to lead up to that military plan. The French had their plan, Plan 17. So we'll be speaking about those not today, probably the next class. And then the first of the important battles, because that von Schlieffen Plan didn't work. And when it didn't work, the 2 sides got bogged down and started building trenches. When they started building trenches, it became a defensive war. And the short war that everyone envisioned didn't happen. It ended up being a 4-year war with horrendous consequences. So let's move first to the fateful day in June of 1914. And for some reason, I'm not getting it's, the first slide. So let me see what happens. Okay. All right. So we start June 28th of 1914, and this is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, this is not a it's not one of the only causes of the war. As we saw previously, the different alliances and so on, the increase in weapons and technology and so on, all sort of led in this direction. And then there were two Balkan wars, but the actual immediate cause, the shot that triggered the First World War, actually was the assassination of the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, on June 28th of 1914. And after that unfortunate event, things escalated and snowballed to the point where by the end of the summer, war was, in fact, not only imminent, war broke out in the beginning of August of 1914. And actually by May of 1915, there was hardly a single major power, European power, that wasn't involved in the war, along with the various colonies that contributed troops and so on. Now, this assassination was the result of a concerted effort by a group of young men in Serbia. Now, Serbia is a Balkan country, and Serbia was once under the control of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, but Serbia gained its independence, as did a number of other Balkan countries. But two of those countries never did gain independence. They were colonies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and those were the countries of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were supposed to get their independence because at a previous conference, the conference of Treaty of Berlin, a number of years earlier, the Austro-Hungarian government agreed that it would have a mandate over Bosnia and Herzegovina. And a mandate meant that they would only control those countries until they felt they were adequately prepared to assume their own governance and be independent. But it never happened, and probably wouldn't have happened. So this group, the Black Hand, these were young men, Serbians, who were impatient and wanted to see the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina. More specifically, what they wanted to see was the federation of a whole state of South Balkan nations, that would be Yugoslavia. And in order to realize their dream and their expectation, they realized that what they had to do was, stir up some kind of controversy and instability, and that would then lead them to the opportunity to get rid of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or at least its control over the countries of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Austria was a very weak country. It was a very weak empire at the time. Hadn't won a war in a very long time. The last war it fought, it lost against what became the German Empire. And so they saw the opportunity to perhaps rile things up and get rid of the Austro-Hungarian presence in the Balkans. And they also believed correctly that the Russian Empire would support them. So when the Archduke and his wife were assassinated in June of 1914, they started the cycle that would lead ultimately to the instability that they craved, but not in the way they anticipated. So what happened? The Austro-Hungarian government realized that these groups, these irredentist groups, these revolutionary groups that wanted to see independence from Austria-Hungary were a threat to whatever Austria-Hungary still had left. It was a dying empire, a very old empire, House of Habsburg, but the emperor at the time, the Kaiser, Franz Joseph, was a very old man, a doddering old man, not really in control very much anymore, but his military and his advisors were. And they saw what happened to the Archduke and his wife as a threat to their continued control. Now, they didn't care for the Archduke and his wife. I mentioned earlier on, it was a morganic marriage. The Duchess had absolutely no value in terms of the continued monarchy. The Archduke, would he live to succeed his uncle, Franz Josef, would have become the new emperor, but his wife and children would have had no pretensions to the throne or anything, because it was a marriage that was not favored by the emperor, because Sophie Chotek was an aristocrat but not a royal, and the Archduke married her despite warnings from his uncle. It was a tremendous love affair, and he just defied his uncle, the Kaiser, Franz Josef, and they married anyway. In fact, the only reason that they were in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, on June 28, 1914, was because as a military figure, the Archduke was there to review the troops, because the troops had to fight for Austria-Hungary should the need and occasion arise. Ironically, June 28th was the 14th anniversary of the Archduke and his wife. And it was also a very unfortunate choice of the day, because way back in the 16th century, the Bosnians had been defeated by the Ottoman Turks. It was a day that was not celebrated as a victory in Bosnia, quite the contrary. It was another example and reminder of their status as colony of the greater empires. And so all in all, it was not a particularly auspicious day for a visit in Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital. And there are questions whether, in fact, the Serbian government warned the Austrians that something like this might happen. It's not clear, it's sort of back and forth. It's also not clear whether the Serbian government had a hand in the assassination, probably not. But the result was a great anger at the Serbian government for allowing this terrorist group to organize there and move across the border, and also fear that these insurrectionist groups were going to undermine whatever power the Austro-Hungarian Empire still had. So this generated what became known as the July Crisis. And ultimately, with the alignment of different countries as time went on, during that summer, it was known as the July Crisis, because things moved pretty quickly and in a very unfortunate direction during the month of July. Now, Austria-Hungary, if you move to the next slide, Austria-Hungary was edging toward war because they saw the need, or at least the military and the political figures in Austria saw the need to address this very quickly before things get out of hand. And but they realized they were not really ready to engage in war, because they knew the Russians would probably come in on the side of the Serbs. However, there was always a historical, linguistic, cultural connection between Austria and Germany. And so the Austrians counted on the Germans to basically back them up. And Germany, unfortunately, was eager to accommodate them. Germany had a far superior army. Which was rather unfortunate was the fact that the Germans also felt that they were sort of denigrated or overlooked as a major power. They wanted, as I said, their place in the sun. And they figured by sponsoring and supporting this military effort, Germany would come out as a major player on the continent, because they didn't believe the Russians had much power, military power to offer. It was a very large country, very large, spread over 2 continents, and therefore it would take a long time for them to move troops to the front. Plus, they'd lost the humiliating war in 1905 against the Japanese. So all in all, they didn't really think the Russians would pose much of a threat, and therefore they could exert their own military power, the Germans, and come out at the top and be the major player on the continent. Unfortunately, Germans didn't realize that they already were major players on the continent, and they were far superior to most all of the other powers by virtue of the fact that they were a commercial miracle. Germany, remember, only became an empire in 1871, but by the 20th century, they were already far outpacing all of the other nations in terms of commerce and in terms of their academic institutions and their cultural output. And had they just stuck to their trade, internal and external trade, and continued the growth of their phenomenal industries, Germany would have overtaken everyone else by virtue of its miraculous rise in terms of commerce. But Germany had a military tradition and tended to think in terms of militarism and believed that the only way to become this major power was through use of the army and the navy. Because after all, it was the army and naval forces that allowed for Germany to become an empire in 1871 after defeating the Danish, the Austrians, and the French in those different wars in the 1860s and 70s. So the Germans were all prepared and gung-ho on giving the Austrians their support, military and otherwise, and they came to give them what was known as the blank check. That was in July, the beginning of July of 1914. That blank check basically gave the Austrians the sense that they were, in fact, able to engage in war, even though they realized they were not really any sort of military power, and they probably couldn't even withstand the Russians. But with the Germans behind them, the thought was that, we can do this. However, there was a lot of misgiving and concern. And one of the mistakes the Austrians made was they kept saying, we're not ready yet, we're not ready yet. And they kept putting off the day when they would finally declare war against Serbia and the Russians would enter. But by procrastinating and putting it off, they basically lost the benefit of an immediate outbreak of war. Because if they'd have attacked Serbia immediately, they would have had the benefit of some sort of sympathy from the rest of the world. After all, their Archduke had just been assassinated with his wife. And so even though no one really cared that much in Austria, it was a good excuse for them to avenge that death. And in the rest of the world, the thought was, you don't just assassinate a royal figure like that who was next in line to be the emperor. And so there was some sympathy for an Austrian attack on Serbia to avenge this bloodshed and so on. But as time went on and the weeks went by, that was lost. The Archduke was sort of forgotten, and the original justification for the war was sort of somewhere on the back burner. And now the Germans were the ones who somehow were associated with the outbreak of the war, and with good reason, because the Germans actually could have stopped. There were a number of opportunities for the Germans actually to pull back and to halt the Austrian offensive, and the war would have been averted. But in their eagerness, the Germans wanted, especially their military wanted, this opportunity. And for the reasons I already mentioned, plus the new weapons that the Germans had, which they wanted to try out, at least the military wanted to try them out. And so the blank check sort of bolstered the feelings of the Austrians, of their notion that they were ultimately in a position to engage in war. And again, the Germans could have prevented that. Later on, by the way, a few weeks later, the British twice, on two occasions, tried also to negotiate some sort of a peaceful resolution under their foreign secretary, Lord Grey, Edward Grey, but it was rejected. Ironically, the German Kaiser at some point got cold feet and realized he'd made a big mistake and that this was not going to have a happy ending. But in the meantime, he was away on his yacht. It was the summer. So he was on the big Hohenzollern, the big royal yacht, enjoying the summer. And his military advisors were the ones who were in control and moving forward towards war, to the point where then it was impossible really to stop it and to avoid any kind of a broader conflict. So this blank check, as I said, beginning of July, came from the German officials. They reassured the Austrian government of its support. And the ambassador, the German ambassador in Berlin, wrote back to the king that the German army wanted very much to be part of this Austrian attack. And ultimately, the emperor fell in line. Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany fell in line with his military advisors and went along with the notion that we have to settle accounts with Serbia. By the way, not to confuse you, Germany, remember, only became an empire in 1871. But within that empire, there were all these different units. There was Prussia, which was a kingdom. There was Saxony, which was a kingdom. That ambassador was the Saxon ambassador from Saxony to Berlin. There was a king of Saxony, even though there was an emperor of the whole German Empire, who was also the king of Prussia. It's a little confusing, but that's the reference to that king. In the meantime, the head of the military in Germany was Count von Moltke, M-O-L-T-K-E, and he was the chief of the German general staff, and he was all gung-ho on the Austrians teaching the Serbs a lesson. Now, his uncle, Helmut von Moltke the Elder, was a major figure in the Franco-Prussian War back in 1870. This was his nephew. He wasn't his uncle, right? He was not quite the military figure that his uncle had been. You'll see that once things hit the fan and the war broke out and so on, he became a bit nervous and made some decisions that probably are responsible for prolonging the war for 4 years and probably also for the ultimate defeat of Germany 4 years later. The Germans believed that they could deal with a wider war because in 1905, the head of the military, the general staff, a guy by the name of Alfred von Schlieffen, devised a plan for just such a situation as World War I provided. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly work out the way von Schlieffen envisioned, because von Moltke got scared and a little nervous. We'll talk about that separately when we talk about the von Schlieffen plan, and changed the strategy of von Schlieffen, and things didn't quite work out according to what the Germans envisioned in a two-front war with the French on one side and the Russians on the other. In July, basically mid-July, July 19th of 1914, the Austrian-Hungarian government issued an ultimatum to Serbia. And that ultimatum had 10 points. I just want to read one of the important ones because it's the key one. It's the one that ultimately led to the hostilities, because the government of Serbia actually agreed to 9 out of the 10 demands that the Austrian government made, but they couldn't agree to one of them. And that was the fifth one. They would accept in Serbia representatives of the Austro-Hungarian government for the suppression of subversive movements. In other words, the Austrians not only wanted all these subversive movements banned, amongst other things, but they wanted to send their people from Austria-Hungary into Serbia to see what was going on, to make sure that everything was carried out as they anticipated. And the problem with that was, when you allow a foreign nation into your country to cross your borders, you're not a country anymore. right? The borders have been violated, and borders are what create nation states. So they couldn't agree to that because that would have, in essence, been the end of Serbia. So by refusing that point in the ultimatum that Austria-Hungary had issued, there was no way that war could be avoided. And in fact, the Austrians didn't want to avoid the war because the Germans didn't want to avoid the war, and the Austrians were pushing them. The Germans were pushing the Austrians, rather, to engage in war and take care of Serbia once and for all, and thereby establish the primacy of the German army and the power of the German state in Europe. So it was a non-starter. There was no way that this ultimatum could be satisfied and the war averted. Now, in England, British Prime Minister Sir Asquith, H.H. Asquith, tried on various occasions to halt the march towards war, realizing that this is not going to have a happy ending. And many people blamed Asquith in different ways, that they said, yeah, he was actually secretly dealing with the French and the Russians to prepare for the war, which he was. That didn't mean he didn't want to avoid it if possible, but he also realized that war in 1914 was really necessary. And the reason it was necessary was, interestingly, with one big exception, the reason that war in 1939, during the Nazi period, was also unavoidable. There's only one difference. In 1914, the Germans desired to have supremacy on the continent and to expand their borders. In 1939, the Germans wanted to have ultimate power and domination and control and expand their borders. In 1939, Hitler referred to it as Lebensraum, the need for living space for Germany. As they expand, then they need more natural resources and so on. The only difference really between the German thought process in 14 and in 1939 was the Holocaust. In 1939, it was a racial war, in addition to the political and geopolitical war that the Nazis fought. In 1914, the war didn't have the racial component that it did later on, but basically same thought process. And so Asquith, while he tried to avoid this imminent impending war, realized the danger of Germany. And we mentioned that earlier on, as Germany progressed in so many different ways, it became, and it's right in the middle of Europe, it became a threat both east and west, Russians on one side and the French on the other side. So therefore, war really was justified. Now, very often people speak of an unjustified war and a waste of human lives and material and industrial power and so on. It wasn't a waste. Every death in a war is a horrible thing. And unfortunately, as we know, wars are fought by the young, right? And so it's even worse. These are people with their whole lives ahead of them. I don't subscribe to the fact that this war was unnecessary, because but for World War I, at least temporarily blocking the aggression of the German Empire, true, there probably wouldn't have been a World War II, but on the other hand, we wouldn't be having a discussion because the Germans would have expanded all over the place and wiped out all these other independent countries and expanded their Lebensraum, their living space, and ultimately destroyed any notion of democracy that still existed in these other countries. So it wasn't an unnecessary war, it was a tragic war. And as we know, numbers vary, but when it was over, 10 million people were dead, and millions of people suffered physical impairments and mental disease and so on. And then came the pandemic of 100 years ago, the Spanish flu, which is clearly an outgrowth of World War I because of the lack of proper nutrition and the lack of fuel. So the winters were brutally cold without heat and so on and so forth. And 4 years of deprivation, obviously, the stage was set for some sort of a horrible pandemic. And indeed, that's what happened at the end of World War I. So yes, the loss of life was catastrophic. The destruction of institutions and of landscapes and of industries was monumental. We'll see shortly, probably the next time, a brief documentary on the atrocities of 1914 and what the Germans did when they came through Belgium, destroying, amongst other things, the University of Louvain in Belgium, which had one of the greatest libraries in Europe at the time, just for no reason, arbitrarily and fortuitously burning down the entire library of countless and incredibly valuable and irreplaceable medieval manuscripts, in addition to killing people, innocent civilians, and committing all sorts of other atrocities along the way. Yeah, it was horrible. But to have not engaged the Germans would have had perhaps far greater consequences later on. Now, the Serbian government replied to the ultimatum. As I said, they didn't. It's the next slide. They didn't go along with that one provision in the ultimatum, and therefore war was inevitable, firing across the Danube and the beginning of hostilities. The different sides now were aligning. Remember, there were already these alliances, the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, and so on, that existed prior to 1914. Now, these alliances kicked in, and for different reasons, different countries aligned themselves with their historical alliance partners, but there were other issues involved. What happened, interestingly, was the Austrians were prepared to go to war. The Germans were prepared to go to war. It just happens at the beginning of July, the president of France, Raymond Poincaré, was visiting Russia. They had this alliance, and they were certainly concerned about what might transpire as the tensions built up. The Germans intentionally waited for Poincaré to be on his boat on the way back to France before they gave the Austrians the go-ahead to start the war. They thought this way the French would be somewhat riled by the whole thing. But indeed, the French backed Russia, period from July 20th to 23rd, because they, had a common enemy. The common enemy was Germany, which was on the eastern side of France, and a war there was inevitable. We mentioned it earlier on. We talked about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, when the Germans were successful, defeated the French, and then occupied Alsace-Lorraine, two of the important French provinces on the border. So inevitably, there was going to be a war, and that was in the West. Then there were the Russians in the East. And as the Germans made clear that they had intentions of expanding, there was only one way to expand. That was going eastward. Same thing happened in World War II. So the French then backed the Russians. So we have, so far, the Germans and the Austrians, German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the way, the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not want to go to war. The head of state, Tisza, was against engaging in war because he believed that Austria-Hungary was not prepared or capable, even with German support, to engage in war, and it was going to have a horrible outcome. It was right. But in the Austrian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the military decisions were made, they were all prepared to go. Right? So now it became a full-fledged summer crisis because the French are ready to back the Russians. The Russians first had a partial mobilization of troops and then moved it to a full mobilization of troops. What that means is mobilization doesn't mean you've gone to war. It means you're getting all the soldiers and everything in place if you have to go to war. but the Germans and the Austrians took the Russian mobilization as a declaration of war, which it wasn't. But now they responded by declaring war against Russia, and of course Russia was backing the Serbs. So the Serbs and the Austro-Hungarians are engaged in moving their troops and mobilizing. This is towards the end of July, July 24th to 25th of 1914. As I mentioned, the Russians ordered this partial mobilization first and then a full mobilization. If you move to the next slide, you can see, I can't read it. Unfortunately, Russian is not one of my languages, but it's a Russian World War I poster, war poster, encouraging the troops to move forward towards the front. On July 25th, Austro-Hungarian Empire actually declared war on Serbia. So the first shots are fired. Germany has now mobilized its troops in the beginning of August, August 1st through 3rd, in response to the Russians and the outbreak between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. On August 4th, the British declare war. It's August 4th of 1914. Now, a very interesting issue with respect to the British and their declaration of war. The question is asked, why exactly did the British go to war? The French, we know, had an alliance with Russia. The British and the French were never exactly great partners. There was always tension, but now they had to deal with Germany, which always brings countries together when they have a common enemy. But there was another issue, and the other issue we're going to talk about in more detail when we get to that von Schlieffen plan. But the following was the issue. The Germans had this war plan, and the war plan called for a two-front war. First on the west against France, then on the east against Russia. The way the plan was conceived and configured, the German army would have to attack France both through the center of the country, through Alsace-Lorraine, and moving troops all the way up north and sweeping down and then encircling Paris, right? They would have troops moving through the middle and encircling Paris from the south, and the troops from the north encircling Paris, the capital of France, from the north. There's just one problem. In order to carry out this plan, it meant violating the neutrality and the sovereignty of two countries, Holland. The Dutch basically gave in, and Belgium. The Belgians didn't. The Germans tried to convince Belgium and its king, Albert, to allow the German troops through, but he said no, under no circumstances. We're a sovereign nation, although a rather new nation. Belgium only became a nation in the middle of the 19th century, and it was vulnerable. It didn't have a great army, and it was a small country and surrounded France in the south and Germany, you know, on the west. I'm sorry, on the east. And but the King of Belgium, Albert, said no. He would not allow the Germans. So the Germans had only one choice. You're not giving us permission. We're going through without your permission. Now the British had an agreement with Belgium that they would step in if the Belgians were threatened, particularly by Germany. And the British had a reason for this, because if you look at a map, Germany is on the east of Belgium. On the west of Belgium is a body of water, British Channel. And the next stop is England. So Belgium, in a sense, was a buffer zone between Germany and England, and Germany and Britain. And so the British had a vested interest in propping up the Belgians. So when Germany disregarded the boundaries, the sovereignty of Belgium, the British then were obliged to come in. And that brought Britain into the war. And you can see the on that slide that has a picture of the front page of a British, I've never heard of this British newspaper, but it's called the Argus. It doesn't exist anymore. But it proclaims Britain and France at war with Germany. So now Britain, France, and Russia are at war with Germany. Germany, Austria-Hungary is at war against Serbia and Russia. Russia, of course, on the side of the British and the French. And those are known as the Allies in World War I. That was Britain, France, Russia, and a number of other countries that joined along the way. Those are the Allies. The others were in World War I known as the Central Powers: Germany, Austria-Hungary, ultimately the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria. A number of other countries entered the fray, especially the British, who had all these overseas colonies. So the Anzac countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, with Commonwealth, and so on, they all joined as well. The French had colonies in Africa. Those colonies sent soldiers as well. And the British, of course, had India, and so on and so forth. So it very quickly became a true world war and a global conflict. And that's the progression of events that led to the real outbreak of war on the very beginning of August of 1914. Now, the next time we'll talk about those war plans and that first two battles that set the stage for a prolonged, dug-in trench warfare of 4 years. But now, I want us to look at the first of the documentaries that sets the stage for the summer of 1914 and how things move forward. They will show up on your screen. Again, while we're waiting, you can always view these at your own pace, or if you want to see them again, because they're posted. Okay, this is called Summer at Sarajevo. Obviously, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, where the assassination took place and the war then proceeded. Can everyone see it? Is everyone viewing it?
On these battlefields, wrote Scott Fitzgerald, my lovely, safe world blew itself up. Terrible twilight of an old world, noisy dawn of our times. This was World War I. It was the last time you could look at the face of war and see the features of men. This is the kind of war it would be. The machines were starting to emerge. Along with the names of victims, they would rub out old codes that men had lived by and fought by. After this ship, the Lusitania, there would be no unbreakable rules of war. There would be many other victims. The litter of a primitive D-Day at a remote peninsula called Gallipoli. This is the Austrian battleship, St. Stefan, sinking in the Adriatic only months before the armistice. No orders to abandon ship from its captain. It was an age when commanders could take men to their deaths in the name of nothing but honor. In this war, empires clashed. George V's England would survive, though shaken. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany would crumble. Doomed also, the Romanovs, absorbed in themselves while Russia seethed with change. And the Habsburgs, the antique dynasty of Austria-Hungary. Of the world these kings had inherited, only shadows and echoes would be handed on to us. The echoes would become an overture, the noise of revolution and change. In Winston Churchill's words, not armies, but whole nations broke and ran. Out of the crowds, new faces would appear. A magnetic orator named Lenin. In the trappings of a hero, an Air Force officer named Hermann Goering. Hindenburg, a general who would retire to a presidency. an unsuccessful war leader, Churchill. Europe's first American war hero, General Pershing. His ally and antagonist, Foch. Britain's Prime Minister, Lloyd George. France's old tiger, Clemenceau. Mr. Herbert Hoover of Belgian War Relief. Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the Navy Department. Old soldier-to-be, Colonel Douglas MacArthur. A young ace, Baron von Richthofen, and Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. These were the years when war ventured into a new battleground, the air, and produced a new breed of hero, the last champions of individual combat. Their time would be brief. They, too, would be overtaken by their machine. Heroes of this war, some known, some nameless, would keep searching for answers to its hazards. There would be no answer, except man's power to endure his folly. Behind its president, Woodrow Wilson, a young nation would march to war in the footsteps of the Allies and emerge as their leader. This is the kind of war it would be, a cataclysm. It begins with 2 warning shots fired in the summer of 1914 at a place called Sarajevo. Europe in the vintage year of 1914. Europe in a time of splendid transition, of automobiles with liveried footmen, of absolute monarchs and general strikes. It has been a year of strikes. There has been a decade of war threats and brinkmanship. But it is an age of confidence, which takes crisis in its stride. Men are reasonable, progress continues, peace seems permanent. What spoiled children we are, the Paris editorialist writes, in the last week of June 1914. June 28th in London. King George V and Queen Mary on a short drive to Kensington Palace for a Sunday visit with their relatives. June 28th in St. Petersburg. Tsar Nicholas II holding court at the Romanov Summer Palace. June 28th at Kiel, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II at the official opening of the widened Kiel Canal. He takes a salute of friendship from British ships at the ceremony. In the small Slavic kingdom of Serbia in the Balkans, June 28th is a holiday, festive, patriotic, lively with the spirit of Slav nationalism. Across the border from Serbia is Bosnia, also inhabited by Slavs, but occupied by the alien empire of Austria-Hungary. This is the provincial capital, Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The distinguished visitor in the plumed hat is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew and heir to the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. The Archduke's wife, Sophia, is with him. Minutes before, a bomb was thrown at their car. At the City Hall, they report the ugly incident. From here, they will drive on into the path of calamity, a street where a boy stands armed with a pistol. Two shots end the lives of the Archduke and his wife. The assassin is a tubercular high school student named Gavrilo Princip, a Slav patriot inspired and armed by a Serbian agent. Sarajevo is ransacked by Austrian occupation troops, while the bodies of the victims are shipped home to Vienna, to a funeral without pomp or tears. The lifelong disappointment to his uncle, the Emperor, the Archduke will hardly be missed. In the words of a Viennese writer, Stefan Zweig, he lacked everything that counts in Austria, amiability and charm. In Vienna, the crowd will gather not for the victims, but for a rare view of the old emperor, Franz Josef, now 84, who comes into the city from his summer palace, but will not attend the funeral. Barely interrupts the music in the cabarets. But behind the scenes, tragedy is being turned into opportunity by Austria's foreign minister, Count Leopold von Berchtold, and the military chief, General Franz Conrad von Hetzendorf. From the German Kaiser, Austria's ally, they get assurances of support for any measures they may take to punish what he calls this detestable crime. After handing over this blank check, the Kaiser allows himself to be hustled off on his usual summer cruise by his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. Everything will be taken care of. There is no reason to change plans. No reason for any of Europe's rulers to change plans. In the English Channel off Spithead, King George proceeds with his own summer routine, the annual review of the fleet. At St. Petersburg, the Tsar entertains a summer guest, Raymond Poincaré, President of the French Republic. A ceremonial visit between allies. Sarajevo has disappeared from the headlines. Society has set out on its circuit of leisure with government officials among the crowd. Europe's less leisurely millions will satisfy themselves with an occasional Sunday at the beach. The weather is marvelous. On July 21st, an American tourist, Colonel Edward House, sails home with his earlier anxieties relieved. Europe, he has written to his friend, President Woodrow Wilson, is wrapped up in sports and social doings. People are talking about the recent regatta at Henley, won for the first time by an American crew, a Harvard boat captained by a young Bostonian named Leverett Saltonstall. Everywhere, the omens are peaceful. Everywhere except in Vienna. On July 23rd, the Austrian leaders execute the scheme they started weeks before. They persuade Emperor Franz Josef to sign a harsh document. Punish Serbia, and he will crush the Slav nationalist movement that has been gnawing at the southern provinces of his empire. Suddenly, Europe rings with a dread word of alarm: ultimatum. Ultimatum is only a formality. Vienna is preparing to act no matter what the response. Serbia, under its young regent, Prince Alexander, in effect agrees to Austria's terms, but nevertheless calls up its troops. Europe, secure, self-satisfied Europe, is stepping toward the brink. In late July 1914, the Tsar appears in St. Petersburg before an agitated crowd. The small Slavic country of Serbia has been threatened. Russia, the big brother of Slav nations, is aroused. The slogan, in the streets and in government, support our ally Serbia. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, alerted by the sounds of gathering crisis, cuts his cruise short and hurries back to Berlin, an unsuspecting captive of his advisors. The text of Serbia's soft reply to the Austrian ultimatum is kept from him, in order to leave Austria free to act. As big powers are drawn in, the diplomatic channels begin to flood with activity. Berlin to Vienna, Belgrade to St. Petersburg, to Paris. On July 27th in Berlin, government leaders report to the Kaiser in a special crisis session. That same day in London, a voice of moderation speaks up. Sir Edward Grey, England's languid foreign secretary, urges Berlin to mediate between the principals. But the message is ignored. On July 28th, convinced that outsiders will back off, Austria takes the ultimate step: war against Serbia. From the Danube River dividing the two countries, Austrian gunboats shell the Serb capital of Belgrade. With war on in the Balkans, the Tsar is urged to mobilize his armies. He stalls, orders a limited call-up, initiates a desperate correspondence with the Kaiser. I shall be overwhelmed by pressure. Do what you can. Signed, your loving Nicky. The answer from Berlin. I fully understand. I am exerting my utmost influence. Signed, your devoted friend and cousin, Willie. But it is too late. The pressure too strong. Convinced by his ministers that Germany is getting ready to strike, the Tsar orders all-out mobilization. Now, all over Europe, the crowd rises to the allure of war. The war fever rages, and even the intellectuals are not immune. German novelist Thomas Mann will embrace the war as a purification, a liberation, an enormous hope. English novelist H.G. Wells: defeat Germany for the sake of peace and disarmament throughout the world. Dr. Sigmund Freud of Vienna: all my libido is given to Austria-Hungary. A few speak in revulsion. Albert Einstein deplores this species which boasts of its freedom of will and yet makes war. But now, war is Europe's will. In Berlin, the war spirit is inflamed by the movement of Russian troops toward German borders. A fatal mechanism is turned on. The clockwork of war plans. Time, ready. On August 1st, the clock strikes. The Kaiser summons his nation to war. War against Russia. But the first objective on the timetable is Russia's ally, France. France, confronted with a brutal German ultimatum, tempted by an opportunity to regain its lost territories of Alsace-Lorraine. France gets ready for a German attack. Announced by ultimatum, it will come by way of neutral Belgium. France and Belgium, Russia and Germany, Serbia and Austria. Before it is over, 7/8 of the world's population will take sides in the war. England watching apprehensively from the sideline. For England, the issues are defined by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. We could not allow the German fleet to come down the channel to attack the French ports. But in addition, we were morally committed. Only Britain could defend the fair play of the world. Churchill has already deployed the fleet against surprise attack. Now the government, under Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, sends Germany an ultimatum in behalf of France and Belgium. For 5 hours, Britain waits for an answer, which never comes. On August 5th, Britain joins the nations on the march to war. Men who march in these crowds will later recall their feelings with wonder and horror. The mood of a schoolboy holiday, the relief that is almost a rapture, and the confidence. Paris in 6 weeks, Christmas in Berlin. Only the leaders seem to waver. The Kaiser tells his generals when it is too late, "Gentlemen, you will regret this." And Sir Edward Grey of England utters a phrase that will haunt the world for generations. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. Years later, after the 9 million deaths, the 37 million casualties, after the crash of empires, the upheaval of whole societies, years later, a member of the Austrian royal family will say, This is not what the leaders intended. What they had in mind was a limited war.
Okay, so I think it very adequately sums up the beginnings and the first phase of World War I. I just want to comment on a few things that were mentioned in the course of this documentary. They spoke in the beginning of the Lusitania. So Lusitania, they show you the beautiful passenger liner. Lusitania was indeed a passenger ship that was owned by the Cunard Lines. And it was traveling from New York Harbor across to England with a stop in Ireland. So May of 1915. The majority of the passengers were Americans, some very prominent Americans. And just before it reached the shores of Europe, it was actually just outside of Ireland. It was torpedoed by German submarines and sunk, with the majority of the individuals, of course, being killed. That was one of the acts in the early phases of the war that really outraged Americans. It wasn't enough for President Wilson to declare war yet, but between what happened in Belgium, we'll talk about that, and the Lusitania, and a bizarre development called the Zimmerman telegram that we'll talk about, things built up to the point where finally the United States had no choice but to declare war against Germany in 1917. They talked in the beginning about a horrible battle, the Battle of Gallipoli. We're going to talk about that in detail too. The Battle of Gallipoli is on the, it was in Turkey, on the Straits of Gallipoli, it's a peninsula, and the British committed very large numbers of troops to fight the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. It was an absolute disaster for the British. The First Lord of the Admiralty at the time was Sir Winston Churchill. That was almost the end of his political career. Fortunately, it wasn't the end of his political career because he came back and was a great leader in World War II. There was a mention of Everett Saltonstall and the rowing team from Harvard. Saltonstall became a major figure, senator from Massachusetts later on. There was a reference to Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer. I have a particular interest in Stefan Zweig. I also have a PhD in German literature. I'm very much interested in Zweig, published a number of things about his writings. And way back when, I had a grant, when I was teaching at the University of Texas, to spend the summer in Vienna doing research. It happened that my great aunt used to vacation in Austria in the summer. She lived in Belgium, and invited me to spend some time with her in Bad Gastein, a resort in the Tyrolean Alps. And she asked what I was doing. I thought I was writing this book about Zweig, and she said, "Oh, it's very interesting because Stefan Zweig had to leave Europe when the Nazis took over and annexed Austria, and he ended up in Brazil, ultimately, and with his wife. He was world-renowned. The Brazilian government provided him with everything he could possibly want, but he was quite depressed, and living outside of Europe was unbearable for him, and ultimately committed suicide. But what's interesting is my aunt told me that she and my uncle were out for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, and they actually met Stefan Zweig and his wife, and they said hello, whatever, and were shocked the next day when they read the newspaper that Zweig and his wife had committed suicide. There's a reference to Thomas Mann, one of my favorite writers. Mann was gung-ho on World War I, very nationalistic, but realized before World War II broke out, where things were trending, and renounced his German militarism and Prussian militarism, ended up living in America. It's a very interesting story. I haven't got time for it. He lived in California, but then because of the McCarthy era and all those things, he ended up going with his wife back to Europe, and he spent his last years living in Switzerland. And then one last point, they mentioned everyone expected a short war. And when the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, announced that he's recognizing all Germans as one nation, no more parties, no more whatever. And he spoke, we saw that scene when he spoke from the palace in Munich to tens of thousands, announcing that Germany was now going off to war and that everyone would be home before the leaves fall. The short war will be home before the end of autumn. There's a very interesting picture that they didn't show of that group of tens of thousands that turned out for the announcement of the German march to war, because in the middle of all those tens of thousands, there's one guy on his knees looking up towards heaven, all obviously all excited and full of enthusiasm for this war. And that individual on his knees, thanking God for the advent of World War I, was none other than Adolf Hitler, who wasn't even German, he was Austrian, but managed eventually to get into the German army as a low-ranking soldier in World War I, and so distraught by the German defeat in World War I that he dedicated his life to politics, and we all know where that went going forward. So that's the introductory documentary with respect to the beginnings of World War I in the summer of 1914, the different empires that ultimately are going to disappear. And we'll go on Thursday following the syllabus. Now, are there any questions or comments or anything that's unclear? You can ask, you can email me or whatever. So stay safe, and we'll see each other at 11 o'clock on Thursday and continue on with the very first phase of World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, the French Plan, and the Battle of the Marne, and probably the Battle of Ypres as well. Take care.
Take care.